over the years, over those 3 years that Mandela had been released, political violence had increased. People were dying by the thousands every year. People were becoming despondent. In 1992, there'd been a massacre, the Sebokeng massacre, where 79 people were murdered in their homes at night, and Mandela had walked out of the talks. In the run-up to Easter weekend, there had been some talks that had restarted, but essentially things were not going very well, and all sides were frustrated with what was going on. Tensions were high. People were wondering, can we get walk that last mile to an election and a new South Africa?
And how important a figure was Chris Hani, and what was the response to his assassination in the country when it happened?
Chris Hani was one of those people. He was extremely charismatic. He'd stand up in front of young people and speak to them. And many people, I would say, felt that, this is what the new South Africa will look like. This is what freedom will look like. And so when he was murdered, it was my first day, coincidentally, on the job as a journalist. I went out to his home. He was lying on the ground, surrounded by other ANC leaders. The people were crying in the street outside in the home. That afternoon, I went back to the office. I tried to drive into Soweto to just get the mood. The South Africa was blowing up at the news of his death. There were riots everywhere. I couldn't drive into Soweto, the most populous black township in the country. There were deaths being reported by the police from all over South Africa. There was huge anger. There were threats and intimidation by white right-wing elements who wanted to pull South Africa from the negotiations process. Essentially, that day, and Nelson Mandela says this in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, F.W. de Klerk writes this as well. Across the board, Desmond Tutu, others were saying, we are staring war in the face here if we don't do something about it.
And eventually, Nelson Mandela gives a passionate and really important speech. Tell us about that.
That's the delicious thing about history, Hugo, that in the South African mind, in my mind, even in Mandela's book, we all tell ourselves the story, and it's the story that we've sat with for 30 years now, that Mandela is in his rural home in Kunu. F.W. de Klerk is at his grandmother's farm in the desert, in the Klein Karoo, and that the two men agree that Mandela will go on television, and Mandela does go on television that evening. But the speech that he gives that evening is actually, it's a dud. It's not, he didn't have any participation in writing it. He didn't, it wasn't the speech of his life, as F.W. de Klerk says in his biography as well. It's only 3 days later that Mandela then says, you know what, my speech didn't really go anywhere. I got to the studio too late, after 10 p.m. People didn't hear it. It wasn't such an amazing speech. And so he says, I've got to go back on television and do another live broadcast. And he participates in the writing of this speech. He changes the top 4 lines of it. And those lines are what is majestic about that speech. He says, fellow South Africans, I'm reaching out to all of you. A white man full of hate came to our country and killed our beloved son, Chris Hani. I'm paraphrasing here. Then he says, a white woman saw this terrible deed and immediately called the police, and she had memorized the registration plate of the car. By doing so, within 30 minutes, this man was arrested, and we know who the killer is. So what he did was take exactly what Janus Valush, the killer, and his accomplices had meant to do, the racial aspect of it, and said, actually, if you say, and you're a black young black militant and say, oh, white people are doing this, let's fight. He said, yes, it's a white man who killed this hero of yours. It's a white woman who saw it and led to the arrest. And to all the white right-wingers who was trying to say, yeah, we are up against black people and so forth, he said, this woman had the presence of mind to immediately see that this was wrong and call the police. And so that juxtaposition of the two was the big breakthrough of the week. And things began to calm down somewhat. Other things happened, but in those 9 days, that was one of the key and pivotal speeches and acts of that week.
And also, I guess the pointing out that the killer had come from outside the country and it was South Africans, standing together thereafter in the speech. How close did the country come to civil war in that period, would you say?
I think it was very close. Over those days, Hugo, every day there were more riots, more deaths, more provocations from many sides, the right wing in particular. People were armed. There were calls for, in the ANC itself, it was, why are we negotiating with the apartheid government? Let's go to war. Around Nelson Mandela, there were militants who wanted to escalate. In the security establishment of the country, there was talk of militias stocking up on guns and so forth and so forth. So we were very close. I think there were two things that happened that I'd like to point out. The first, it was acts of leadership that happened that week. The first one was F.W. de Klerk realizing when he got the news that that Chris Hani had been murdered, that he could not calm the country. And that's why he called Nelson Mandela, and the two of them had a 30-minute conversation on that Saturday, the 10th of April. That conversation was the beginning of an extraordinary act of leadership. Nelson Mandela had never addressed the nation as a leader per se. And on that day, he was essentially put in a position where he said, my people, and meaning the entire country. So that was the first one. The second one was that F.W. de Klerk, on the Wednesday after the murder, he sat down with his security establishment, with his security cabinet, as it were, and they agreed to give the ANC an election date, which Mandela had said it would calm people to know that we are moving forward, that we are not being held back by this assassination. So there were several acts in that week, acts of leadership that I think took the country forward instead of dwelling on the assassination itself. Because if that had been allowed to happen, people would have got even angrier, divisions would have widened, and we would have been talking about a totally different thing than what we finally had, and that was the 1994 breakthrough.
And look, it's a big question to end with, but I'll ask it anyway. What you're writing about here is basically a moment when South Africa kind of sort of learned optimism, which led to led to Nelson Mandela becoming president, led to the transformation of the country. There are some today who would take it as a truism that optimism has been squandered over the years, whereas others would say, no, you know what, the kind of bloodshed that was feared back then never did happen. South Africa is now a sort of stable and established nation. What would your take on basically the development of South Africa since that moment be today?
I think there are two elements, Hugo, and thank you. That's a lovely question. The first one is that I would agree with you. South Africa has not fulfilled its potential. South Africa is a country that had huge a bequest of peace and democracy and optimism, as you point out. We've squandered it. We've squandered it by not living up to the values, not living up to the promise of that moment that Mandela, as a president, spoke about. We've failed to transform the country. We've failed to keep the country on its development path. South Africa has one of the worst inequality statistics in the world, one of the worst poverty statistics in the world, and one of the worst unemployment statistics in the world. We have 66% unemployment among young people. As I speak to you now in South Africa, there's what's called load shedding. Those are electricity blackouts. And at the moment, we are at a stage where for 10 hours of the 24 hours of the day, there is no power in your home. So many people who can afford it are buying their own inverters, generators, and so forth, essentially making their own power. This is a massive digression from where we should be as a country. So South Africa today is a country that has democracy, that has that enjoys the fruit of that moment that we've just spoken about, and yet its leadership is failing its people. Yeah. Its leadership is failing to step up and do the right thing for the promise of that moment. So that optimism has been squandered, has been absolutely squandered.